Hello, everyone. I hope you're feeling well and having a peaceful day today. In this video, we'll dive into a powerful family story where love, control, and sacrifice collide, and one heartbreaking question changes everything. Can a son forgive his father when the truth could destroy them both? Stay with us as this emotional journey unfolds. And if you find this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The spacious living room felt colder than usual. Dim, golden light from the chandelier spilled down from above, but instead of warmth, it carved sharp shadows across Mr. Juan's face. His jaw was tight, his brows drawn together, anger etched deep into every line. He stood stiffly in the center of the room, offering stiff, hollow New Year wishes to everyone present. The words sounded polite, but they carried no joy. Then his eyes swept around the house, the cracked walls, the old furniture, the worn floor beneath his shoes. His expression shifted instantly, from forced courtesy to open disbelief. He shook his head slowly, as if what he was seeing offended him on a personal level. His voice rose, echoing through the room, loud and heavy with judgment. How could his son live in a place like this? His gaze hardened, but when he spoke of Diep, his tone briefly softened, just for a moment. He admitted she was a good person, a woman with no parents, yet still kind, still trying to live decently. That alone is admirable, he said, though the words felt backhanded, wrapped in pity rather than respect. Then he turned sharply toward James. The softness vanished. I raised you for 20 years, Mr. Juan shouted. I paid for your education, gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? You come home telling me you want to marry a single mother? The words hit the room like thunder. He went on, emphasizing the family's wealth, their reputation, their education. How could a son from a family like theirs choose someone like Diep? In his mind, it wasn't just a relationship, it was humiliation. Underneath the anger was something deeper, heavier. Years of sacrifice replayed in his head. Not as love freely given, but as a burden he now felt had been wasted. All that effort, all those expectations, turning into shame before his eyes. James stood there, silent at first. His fists were clenched so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. He stared at his father, jaw trembling, swallowing everything he wanted to say. And then he exploded. Why do you always want to control my life? James shouted back. Why do you want to keep me trapped, like I belong to you forever? The room felt like it was shrinking. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if invisible walls were rising between father and son. Mr. Juan refused to back down. His voice was cold, final. If you continue like this, he said, then don't ever come back to this house. For a split second, something cracked inside him. His heart ached, torn between pride and pain, but he hardened himself, convincing himself that this cruelty was necessary, that one day his son would wake up and thank him. Diep wasn't even there, yet her presence filled the room like a shadow. In Mr. Juan's eyes, she became the symbol of betrayal. The reason everything was falling apart. The father has the right to decide his child's life, he declared, his voice trembling despite his certainty. Beneath the anger was regret. Regret for years slipping by, for words that could never be taken back. The light seemed to dim as the argument ended, leaving Mr. Juan standing alone. His rage slowly drained away, replaced by a dull, aching pain. Around him, The room's luxurious decor felt hollow, meaningless. Polished mirrors reflected distorted images of regret. Outside, New Year's Eve carried on, full of promise and celebration, mocking the emptiness inside him. James stood facing his father, his body tense like a string pulled too tight. Years of resentment burned in his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was slower, steadier, but every word cut deep. "You told me once how Grandpa controlled your life," James said. "He pressured you. He judged your choices. But you still made your own mistakes, and you accepted them." His voice cracked. "Why won't you let me do the same?" Mr. Juan's face flushed red as he tried to respond, tried to justify himself. But James didn't stop. The dam had broken. He talked about the past, about leaving for Vietnam just to escape the constant surveillance, the endless interference, about how, even then, his father followed, stepping back into his life, controlling everything once again. The atmosphere felt like a cold winter wind sneaking through cracked doors, chilling both of them to the bone. "I'm 28 years old," James said firmly. "I'm not a child anymore. I have the right to choose my own life." Then his voice trembled. "You've always hated her." The anger softened into something closer to desperation. "Please, Dad," he pleaded, "just let me decide my own life." The turning point came when James mentioned the incident he had never forgotten. Diep taking a blow meant for him. A stick raised in anger, redirected by her body. "How did you feel when that happened?" James asked quietly. Mr. Juan fell silent. His eyes dropped to the floor. But James kept going. He spoke of his father's mistakes with Dung's family, how unresolved decisions from the past had poisoned the present. For a moment, hope flickered in James's chest, that maybe his father would finally understand. Instead, the weight of family pride crushed everything. James felt the suffocating pressure of wealth, reputation, and expectations that had stolen his youth. "If anything happens to Diep," James said, his voice echoing through the room, "I will never forgive you." The words lingered long after he finished speaking. Nearby, the fireplace flickered weakly, like dying embers, just like the bond between them. Shadows danced across the walls, full of unspoken regrets. Outside, distant New Year fireworks exploded in the sky, their celebration cruelly contrasting the fractured harmony inside the house. The argument didn't end there. The echoes stayed, ringing in James's ears. His voice dropped, thick with emotion. "What you thought was good for me," he said, barely above a whisper, turned into harm. Tears welled in his eyes. "You hurt me." He paused, then added quietly that there was something else he had to reveal, something he'd kept hidden for too long. The argument still lingered in the air long after the shouting stopped, like smoke that refused to clear. James stood there, chest rising and falling, his voice quieter now, but heavy with pain. "What you believed was best for me," he said slowly, "ended up hurting everyone." His eyes glistened, and for the first time, his anger gave way to exhaustion. He admitted there was a truth he had kept buried, something he never wanted to say out loud. The scene shifted abruptly, away from confrontation and into silence. A simple meal sat on the table. James gently urged Nye to eat more, adjusting her scarf, worried about the biting winter cold. His voice softened when he spoke to her, completely different from the man who had been shouting moments earlier. Mr. Juan wasn't there, but his presence haunted every corner of the room. James kept glancing at the door, waiting for Diep to come home, his anxiety growing with every passing minute. Then came the turning point. James sat alone, phone in hand, scrolling through recorded videos. Clear, undeniable evidence. Enough to send someone to prison. The proof was all there. His hands trembled. "I can't do it," he whispered. "He's my father. He raised me from when I was a baby." Despite the anger, despite the resentment, despite everything that had happened, his father was still his father. James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that truth crush his chest. He made a decision that shocked even himself. He told the helper to delete the videos. The helper hesitated, reminding him of the time, effort, and risk it had taken to gather the evidence. James nodded, his voice shaking. "I know, but I can't send him to jail." Inside, the pressure became unbearable. Regret flooded him. Regret for the lost years, the missed chances to understand one another. He clung to a fragile hope that one day his father might finally recognize his son's love. Diep and Nye became his anchors, symbols of what he needed to protect at all costs. James stayed alert, constantly worried about their safety amid the storm within his family. "Even if he doesn't love me," James said quietly, "he's still everything to me. I can't hurt him." The pace of the moment slowed, like snow falling softly outside the window, covering pain with a thin layer of ice. Later, James sat at the kitchen table, hands still trembling as he reviewed the evidence one last time before deleting it for good. The helper stood beside him, concern evident in their voice. "Are you sure?" James nodded. "I'm afraid of him," he admitted, "but I owe you too much. Still, father is father." He officially stopped the investigation. The results had been solid, convincing, but they would never see the light of day. Then he spoke the words that marked a shift deep inside him. "Even if he doesn't love me, he means everything to me." Somewhere else, Mr. Juan sat alone, finally admitting the truth to himself. His hands shook as he held a glass, his voice barely audible. "I hurt my son." Fear crept in. Fear of his aging body, of his weakening heart, of consequences he could no longer outrun. Back in the kitchen, James tried to calm his thoughts by helping make kimchi. He explained the process slowly, almost philosophically. How things needed time to cool before fermenting. How rushing only ruined everything. It felt like a metaphor for his own life. He worried his father couldn't escape forever. It was only luck that the truth hadn't been exposed yet. James decided that someday he would tell everything himself. His son had suffered enough. The helper praised him for being smart, for choosing restraint over revenge, hoping Mr. Juan would change once he understood the depth of his son's sacrifice. James smiled faintly, thanking them, convincing himself that things would eventually be okay. The atmosphere eased, like a steady heartbeat returning after a storm. Fragile hope hovered quietly in the background. Mr. Juan sat alone in another room, whispering again, "I harmed my son." The dim light revealed every wrinkle, every regret carved into his face. He resolved to reveal the secret one day, hoping his son might finally understand his feelings. He clutched his chest briefly, worry flashing across his eyes. The fear of a heart attack, of dying before fixing his mistakes, pressed heavily on him. James, meanwhile, thanked the helper sincerely. giving them the address so his father could find him if needed. The helper worried about what might happen once the truth came out, but James reassured them. "I know what I'm doing." He confirmed that the videos were gone. His father was well known, powerful, unlikely to face consequences now. The pressure eased slightly. James invited the helper to stay for dinner, but they declined. Their mother had just undergone surgery and needed care. Before leaving, they mentioned taking Diep and Nye on a short trip someday. James nodded, grateful. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. After saying goodbye, James went to pick up Nye. The cold winter air no longer felt as harsh. Later, standing at the doorway, James once again thanked the helper, suggesting they eat together another time. They declined politely and left. That was when James realized how strong his bond with Nye had become, almost like she was his own daughter. The mood shifted completely. Nye laughed as she tried to blow up balloons, cheeks puffed out, asking James to blow harder. He laughed too, fixing a small hole and showing her how to do it properly. He reminded her to study, to sit with Diep and practice the alphabet. The house felt lighter, warmer. Hope flickered quietly, steady and real. Outside, James helped Diep assemble wooden frames. He measured carefully, sawed unevenly, fumbled with the hammer. "Be careful with your hands," Diep reminded him gently. James smiled. "I'm used to it." They discussed sizes, laughed about crooked lines, decided to make 2 more even as the sky darkened. James invited Diep to stay for dinner with Nye, his voice full of sincerity. Twilight settled around them, signaling not an ending, but a beginning. In the small garden, they worked side by side. Diep suggested making the frame rectangular. James measured again, checked for straightness. "One is finished," he said proudly. They assembled it carefully. Diep reminded him not to use too many nails since it would touch the soil. When James suggested resting, Diep shook her head. She was used to hard work. As night fell, James told her to wash up, cook rice, and play with Nye. He handed Nye an apple, praised her for recognizing the first letters, corrected her gently when she made mistakes. Diep sat beside her, guiding her patiently. Warmth filled the space, replacing the earlier conflict. James watched them and felt it deeply. This felt like family. "Study well," he told Nye, his voice low and full. The winter night wrapped around the house, but inside, peace finally settled in.